I think you all know who I am. I'm Inga Reese, Director of the Center for the History of Collecting here at the Frick Collection and Frick Art Reference Library. And I'd like to welcome many of you back from yesterday and welcome those of you who were not able to come yesterday to our symposium, The Americas Revealed, Collecting Colonial and Modern Latin American Art in the United States. This is a wonderful subject for me, for one, to learn about, and I'm looking forward to each and every one of the presentations today. I'd like to reiterate my thanks again to our sponsors, who are all named in your program, and express my heartfelt thanks also to Edward Sullivan for helping me every step of the way in putting the program together. He's just been a model of an advisor in this endeavor. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our director, Ian Wardropper, and Stephen Barry, the chief librarian at the Frick Art Reference Library, for the support that they give us as we plan these events. The events wouldn't happen without Samantha Deutsch and Esme Quadbach, the assistant directors of the Center for the History of Collecting, and I'd like to thank them too. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, as if he really needs any introduction. Joseph J. Rishel, Joe to most of us, is too modest for words because he sent me a bio that was about 4 lines long that listed none of his amazing publications or exhibitions that he has put together for the Philadelphia Art Museum. So I did try to embellish just a little bit. I think everyone knows the extraordinary depth of his achievements as a curator and author of countless publications, and that in 2010 he was the Samuel H. Kress Professor at the National Gallery of Art's Center for the Advanced Study in Visual Arts. And that's just one of the many honors that have been bestowed on him over the years. Joe was born in 1940 in Phelps, New York. He studied at Hobart College and the University of Chicago from 1958 to 68. In 1967, he began working at the Art Institute of Chicago as a lecturer, eventually moving on to associate curator of earlier painting and sculpture. He moved to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1972 as the Associate Curator of European Painting before 1900 and the Johnson Collection, and is now the Philadelphia Museum of Art's Gisela and Dennis Alter Senior Curator of European Painting and Sculpture before 1900 and the Senior Curator of the Johnson Collection and the Rodin Museum. This morning, Joe will open our proceedings by recounting to us the Philadelphia story. Please join me in welcoming Joe Rishel.
Good morning, and thank you for coming out. I'm a mumbler by nature. Yes, this is. Let's take it. I push any button in front of me. And just as preface, let me hasten to say, as part of you will realize, those who are coached in this and were here yesterday and will quickly realize if you're just coming in cold today, there is a spirit among many of this, I would say all of the speakers, that we're bringing up baby. We are sort of still representing a minority point of view, which is that Latin American studies and Latin American art in America's general museums isn't a choice, it's a necessity if you're going to actually tell the true story about things. And the danger of that, of course, we're succeeding, and when you're succeeding, you lose part of the familial underdog sort of sensibilities that are such fun to have about the bad guys and the good guys. And I'm happy to tell you it's hanging in. We're all hanging out in the corners, gossiping and having a dandy time. So thank you, Frick, for pulling our little group together in such a constructive, I think constructive and happy way. Now, this is deeply logical for the quick-minded to understand why we are opening with this beautiful portrait from the Getty of 2 sisters, who are exiled with their mother to Brussels, as is David himself. And if you look very, very carefully down at the envelope that they are reading in Brussels from their father, it says, De Philadelphie, sent from Philadelphia, and they are, of course, the children of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's oldest brother, who escapes and not abandons really, but leaves Europe in 1813 with a delicious amount of loot, some very great pictures that he brings to Philadelphia, a lot of money, some jewels from he was King of Spain, having previously been king of Naples, of course, and established a sort of transatlantic Hispanic era. And you notice he didn't come to New York. I just want to persecute my... But you would have come to Philadelphia too, I'm sure. That sets up sort of a gimmick to get you engaged, to show that globalization, as Dick Huber was telling us last night, is not a new thing. Here you have the King of Spain living out a very good life, building a very established sort of happiness place in Philadelphia, and staying until 1831 and really making a big difference in the new republic, with a very strong Spanish connection and an even stronger French connection. This is, of course, not isolated to the King of Spain. There's the new emissary. As you know, Spain was among the earliest countries to recognize the new republic. They sent their ambassador here. He married a nice woman who had a sensibility for silly hats, I can tell you. They have this portrait. I blush to tell you this portrait is actually painted by Stuart in New York, but they moved with Stuart the next year to Philadelphia, where he holds out for 2 years in the new embassy that's being established, because the government was, of course, being run from Philadelphia in anticipation of Washington, which was still a building. Just this constant sort of coming and going. I should go back for a moment to say one of the strongest indications in legitimization of opening a lecture with this man is he not only cut a great swath in Spanish and French interest in his long stay in the United States, he was also in 1820 offered by the new independent, remembering 1810 is the beginning of Mexican independence, he was offered the emperorship of Mexico, something he wisely gave up. It did not carry through on, and wise he is because less wise than him is a Creole Mexican of great wealth from Valladolid, actually, Augustin Iturbide, who does indeed, having worked on the Constitution and having he does take on in 1821, 22, I can't read the screen from here, 22, the date of these two portraits, which you'll notice are in the Philadelphia collection, and had himself coronated in the cathedral in the great pomp, much based on David's coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte, and this constantly sort of thing. It lasted about seven months. He was forced into exile with his wife and 10 children. They went to Italy, where they were pressed out on Spanish Bourbon pressure. Some of them went to England to hang out there. So there is some little thread to this story. Stick with me. And then, and very ill-advisedly thought, it was told by a certain group that they had lifted, things had returned to his favor. He came with his wife and 2 children back to Mexico, was arrested at the dock, was tried and shot, and leaving the poor old Maximilian Ferdinand to do him in the next emperorship of all of Mexico. But he is the first emperor of Mexico. His wife is granted a grant from the state. She goes back to England, certainly for her children. Her eldest child, the Prince Imperial, becomes a great advocate, becomes a great friend of Bolivar, and is very involved in independence movements throughout South America, etc. It's this very interesting story between aristocracy and Republican values. Why am I dwelling on her? Because it's even better than you can believe. Because then what does she do in all this? She moves to Philadelphia and lives out her life until 1861 and is buried in the church right down the street from my house. Now, how many cities have King of Spain, the Empress of Mexico, all within one sort of football field sort of size city at that point in time? Just to show we've been in the picture for a long time going through. Now, back to the hard facts, many of which you will know already. Just one thing, our newest acquisition at the museum is this Campeche chair. You saw one object from the Metz collection recently. We need Jorge Rivas to set us straight. They are great objects. It's sort of fun to think this is from as you can guess by this very long name. In Philadelphia, you can tell, I suppose it's true of many places, that everyone's last name is everyone's first name is somebody else's last name. You're getting into a network of established society. This is Quaker Society in this case, of a family. This was certainly in the family going back into the 19th century. We just bought it in the estate. I'm showing that there was this connection with the whole Mediterranean, particularly for Edward's interest. And it's a lot of fun. And the young curator, the furniture curator in Philadelphia who acquired this, and very excited to be buying in. This is from an American department where life stops and starts with Harry Pod feet on furniture. You know, we don't see too outside of this. Is as the Met is doing by hiring new Latin staff members in the sort of team, is taking on whole new prospects about working Latin America into the bigger sort of explorations, curatorial activities of the museum. It'd be very nice. We can get it back to the 19th century. And she has been feeding me the stuff, and I will send it to you, Edward, because it's all the literature that, of course, after the establishment of the American Republic, there is an opening up of a direct sort of access to whole new markets, particularly in terms of Philadelphia, the Caribbean. And Jefferson had two allies and actually seemed to have bought into two brokers in Cuban trade, coming into this new whole wave of complete direct access from North America, well, not from the United States, the new republic, to these more established societies, more affluent, must be said, societies working at that point in time. But now going ahead to the professional thing, here is one of our great heroes. As you see, he is director of the Philadelphia Museum and the School of Industrial Arts. Remembering that, as in many places, the Philadelphia Museum was created in 1876 with the centennial fair of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And very much for the purpose, like so many of these big international fairs, was to have old and new objects, in this case ceramics was his great love, there to demonstrate to the next generation a whole new market of competition and connection with international sort of making. He went into Puebla and to Mexico City and became a great scholar. We were talking yesterday about his deep connection in forming the collections at the Met. A great scholar of Maiolica, Maiolica, which we abound in, giving Philadelphia with the Hispanic Society and the Metropolitan, one of the greatest sort of things. He writes beautifully about this. We were hearing yesterday, he writes about 100 and some odd page book solely about Mexican Maiolica, its relationship to its Spanish sources, and its swift, and it's a sort of it's a really national, fired up defendant of sort of conventional, all the negative implications of colonialism, that you must be passive and dependent, that in weather swift time, particularly in Puebla, and the making of these remarkable objects, and they're wonderful to deal with, I must tell you. But with the making of them, they take on their own independent life as creations very early in the game, which he is a great defender of. And happily, there was a time as I'm very interested. Whoops, what did I do? Will it shift the next time? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So there are three principal people for the museum and the making of it. It was the then director in 1909 doing his book about Maiolica, giving us this very strong suit of just that. He was doing American contemporary crafts and Tiffany at the same time, giving us great rich things. I'm very interested myself, one of my pet things is critical fortunes and how the life of these collections ebb and flow, things get sold out. Lots of things got sold out from his collection. Happily, the center of the tile and Maiolica thing was preserved, and gives us one leg up in sort of a consequence justifying my talking to you here today. So that's number one. Even more strongly in ways that has been referred to several times is Henry Lamborn, who's once again a Quaker Philadelphian born outside in Chester County, is a prosperous family, a prosperous agrarian family, educated in England and then in Germany as an engineer and a doctor. As we learned last night, his engineering feature puts him, wherever he went, he collected. He went to the Mediterranean, he collected Etruscan fragments, all sorts he collected sort of not indiscriminately, but like an archaeological, anthropological kind of collection. He had the good chance in 1881 to be part of putting through the train from El Paso down to Mexico City, and was there until 83, at which point he bought more than 80 Mexican paintings, and at a point of anti-clerical activity where I have little visions of carts pulling up in front of churches and pictures being thrown out the windows with Mr. Lamborn just scooping them up and riding on down. He had shown them at the Metropolitan, not that we wished in any way to be rude to our colleagues up the street. They didn't accept this gift. He then showed them at the Memorial Hall, the first, which is a building left over from the International Fair. And here you see him sitting in his space with these pictures. Let me give you a better sense of this. It is about 80 things, a diversifying thing. I must tell you, and I have to look up the name because it was a very pivotal moment in my life. Stay with me. Yes, because when I first went to the Philadelphia Museum in 1970, not first when I was there, but early in my career, Eliza the Boss, which might mean something to you, a woman of great elegance and great charm, came up with her students from the university and in Mexico City for about a week and sort of walked me through this collection, which I knew very little about. It all was by then, by the early 70s, was in storage. This is just a potpourri of what's there. As you see, this is a man who's a serendipitous collector. He's buying what he finds. He loves Mexico. He writes about it wonderfully. He was into urban planning and thought the planning of Mexico City was one of the ingenious plans of all the time. He was really, as you were still getting some residue, a great advocate for looking at these because of the net patterns of colonial values. Somehow the colonial end of it is the lesser thing, which of course we know perfectly well is not. Perhaps the best, let me walk you through a few treasures of it. Perhaps the best known and most famous and most asked after thing is the sign painting, not by her, of Sor Juana. I'm sure everyone in the known knows that Sor Juana. Even I grew up with the thought that after Cervantes, if you want great Spanish, you go to Sor Juana, as one of the great stylists and great writers of the entire sort of history of Spanish language. Herself was a nun, of course, going through. She did do a self-portrait. This is one variant on it. The great problem, you can imagine, it is a sort of very important thing. The problem is it's in actually rather bad state. And when it's hard to show as a work of art, just so much of it, and the conservators have been kind, but you can't really pull it up. So we have little fights between if it's an important sitter, but a less than sort of important painting, what do? You keep it down most of the time, and you show something like this, much lesser being in this ravishingly beautiful nun's portrait, which we have two in these ways. In ways, he was a metallurgist, and I think there's I will say, Clara Bartolini, known to many of you, has taken up, I suppose, going back into the 70s, an interest in this collection, has written very nicely for it, and has brought it out and back into the light as a critical sort of thing, having two articles about it, which is very thoughtful. She's the one who proposes that many of the objects are on copper, which is not so unusual, but he was a metallurgist, whatever you call them, by training, so I'm just going to show you just either my favorites. Here you see the back. This is a schoolboy's text, just the recycled copper plates from printing, of course. But these things, and I would characterize the collection, it's very large, that goes from very good to less than very good. At its very best, sometimes, in this case, the greatest pleasures, and they're very great pleasures I find over the years working with the collection. The great pleasures go with the more modest things which sort of get under your skin. They're the bombastic big things. That's what we have to work on now, and we have been trying, as you'll see. But it gives us there by his estate sues the way he willed out his gift, so they don't come to the museum until 1903. But it means that there in the Philadelphia Museum is a bedrock of 80 very wonderful, including masterpieces like this, and an absolute masterpiece like this. Important touchstones for this sort of field that different generations have either neglected, been slightly curious about, but it certainly gives us, now that we're getting this whole machine back in gear, in the tradition, using the inheritance we're so lucky to have, into things. It's very interesting that in can you see the date from here? Yes, 1940. Well, anyway, the then deputy director was showing the collection. I think it was the last time, not the last time, but in the 40s and between the wars. It was one of the few times it was shown. It sounds like it's being shown sort of as an anthropological specimen. When you see Aboriginal art on a poster for something, run for your life would be my counsel of these sorts of things. But it has been various responses to from various generations. And thirdly, my third hero, you had the first two, partly, is Henry Clifford. Henry Clifford, I want to know lots more. happily, there's a dissertation being done with you-know-who on this very subject, and I'm not going to go off track. He's an immensely gifted man who did one of the first Manet shows and Matisse shows in America before the Museum of Modern Art in Alfred Bar. He had very diverse interests. He was a great collector himself of Cubism, the Douanier Rousseau, true masterpieces. He was an affluent Philadelphian himself who married into a very large fortune, which gave him great levity to live in Florence or in Vevey in Switzerland, or himself in Mexico in the city, and make very strong alliances starting in the 30s with Mexico. He came into our lives strongly again with Edward Sullivan, which you can see in a minute. And all the next 32 slides I've lifted straight from, I hope you see this as a little homage, Edward, that all the next images are filled straight from your publication. So. And I can't wait to see what the man looked like, because the only views I ever see is his back photographing other people. I'm sure he was very nice looking. But here you see in his friendship with a great pal of his, who we'll get back to in a minute. And he does this critical show in 33 and 43. It is, after all, the war, and what does a very cosmopolitan person do stuck in the United States during the war? You play up the Mexican card, because that's where you can still do it. He does a very sort of, having had this very rich life there, he does this hugely ambitious show in Philadelphia of Mexican art, having encouraged various people. Here's an installation shot of the whole thing. It's a magical thing that happens. It has something to do with social mobility and class. He was a very elegant and well-born man in an affluent society. Nearly all the fun thing is watching these established Philadelphia people be introduced to in this very advanced sort of new art, which is contemporary Mexican art from all sorts of diversity. And I have never done a list, but this show is probably, 200 objects or so. And to what degree the works that were on loan from various dealers, what have you, from Mexico, actually found their way into the collection thanks to to him encouraging his friends to give them, as you'll see in just a minute. What you see is, for example, this was given by, Edward was telling that it was given by his principal friend, this remarkable dealer. This is given to, just keep stick with the credit line. He doesn't stop there the same. The year after that, he does a whole different thing and goes to the greatest landscape painter of 19th century Mexico and does a very large and impressive show about this, of which this is the one thing, and it was just, this is a picture just cleaned recently. This is the great hero of landscape painting in the 19th century, anywhere you look, of course. But this has just been cleaned and is presently hanging in the New American wing, so we're playing it on all sides we can. So here's a man of such breadth and wisdom, what have you. Let me sort of just say, this is the occasion just to walk you through with one aspect that one of the things which is very strong on, as you saw in a minute, we saw it with, well, not hang a second. One very strong side of this is his friendship with Calderon. And wisely enough, Anne Darningart commissioned Edward Sullivan to do a whole show around this, of which I show you the catalog here. Here being the Juan Soriano of choice, we have 4 in the collection. But just what you can do, and the way all these sort of pots, that the art really pulls you through these things. It makes you make these decisions to do this. And I couldn't resist doing this little walk through the show. Here's another photograph of him. See, doing the sight of the picture. The intimacy, what we learned at this, we did it at the same time we did a Frida Kahlo show. It was a very happy sort of thing. And then here's his little spin on these religious votives that failed, and I just can't resist the way when you have things, because meanwhile down the way, perhaps many of you knew that the Arensberg family, Walter Arensberg, living in Pasadena, had a very great collection of Cubism. Marcel Duchamp's best friend is the gift of that family to the Philadelphia Museum of their collection of Brancusi, etc., puts us up there second to maybe the Museum of Modern Art for high classical, particularly French sort of things. Also their interest, they had these Milagros sort of objects in it, then I can't resist that the other sort of side, this is the way that all of this comes in, you deal with what you're dealt in anyway. There were 40 distinguished pre-Columbian sculptures in the Arensberg collection, which are now, and this I love this, here you have, see the Brancusi in between, and there's this whole little new venture which one would love to see, and there is a movement. We're so used to the sort of notion of major critical modernist collecting depending on African images, Demoiselle d'Avignon, etc., etc. It is interesting to see in two cases, certainly this collector, and then of course Diego Rivera himself, that the interest in pre-Columbian sort of things, combining with the same appetite, the same people who are buying Brancusi's, buying Duchamps, buying all that, and how they all fit together. And the happy thing is having this sort of rich basin of experience. Okay, to switch gears entirely, but just to go on, we have a long tradition of a very great print department in the United States. Via Gallery over on Lexington Avenue gave Diego his first show. Here's the gallery itself. There's Mr. Via. You will see, you've already seen in the background, two Diego Rivera frescoes made in New York for the 1930 show of Diego Rivera for containing movable frescoes made in the spot while he was working on the Radio City Murals. In any case, they didn't sell, and they went on, and Philadelphia bought theirs in the 40s. The two you will see, and we will come back to, from the place more better known as a print and drawing gallery of great sort of happily bohemian things. Here's Diego working on those commissions. Mr. Via had nearly, I think he had all of them and parsed them out as time went on. I think you can it just wants you to get right back in the Depression, doesn't it? All these happy times, and you'll see there's a curly-haired man there on the forward who is Charles Grosser, who then is hired in 1941 as the print collector in Philadelphia. Why am I doing this? Because he had inherited from his work at Via a great sense of advanced and contemporary printmaking, a particular penchant for Mexican things, so that we were able quite recently to do a show at the National Museum, and this was in no way, this is not arrogance or anything, of our collection of modern, high modern Mexican printmaking at the National Museum in Mexico as a thing, and it was a blockbuster. People came from far and wide to see these objects from Philadelphia on play there. So that gives us yet another card in the game. Antiquities, colonial material, Maiolica, and then these wonderful prints. It's interesting, I learned the other day, our director tried to buy from Via the painted version of this now at the Museum of Art before he bought the two we got. And so somebody, not good or bad, but the modern got that, we got the other two. So it's all this very small little world. But just giving you a walkthrough. Not without edges of class and prejudice. There's lots of sort of values to be played out in this sort of world. This is a man who's a great hero in my wife's family. My wife was Anne Dornencourt, as many of you know, who was the Minister of Public Education, a very wise man, came to Columbia, very influenced by Dewey at Columbia, became this very broad-spirited man, and might be one of the reasons that Anne Dornencourt, before I knew her, when she was starting work as a young, she was just a kid. I'll show you what oops. See, she was just a very beautiful kid, too, may I say. But she came, and one of the first things she did, the Lambourne collection did laying dormant up until then. She, being her father's child, I suppose, which we'll now get into. How am I doing? I'm rushing 10 minutes. I'll get hooked from the stage. I'm sort of used to this, actually, but she did a beautiful installation and actually bought the crucifix to add to the sort of thing of the Lambourne collection when she first arrived in Philadelphia in 1968. Adding things, her mother, she grew up with this in her bedroom. It really, what do you think she's smoking? See, as Edwards was saying, there's so much to be done still with 19th century Mexican painting, of which this is sort of a corker. I was telling Edward last night in my long and happy life with Nat, and it's inevitable because here she is, of course, charming and wonderful, who said to have arrived in Mexico City in 1926, with $6 in his pocket, spats and a monocle, and a title, we might add. And you can go a long way, I guess, on $6 if you keep them. You're 6'4" to boot, and full of charm. It was fun. I was once with Anne in Mexico City 15 years ago, and she was being interviewed by Diego's daughter in a television program. The bad thing was, if you don't mind, one little personal anecdote. It was 8:30 in the morning. Anne was one of the few museum directors who canceled all breakfast meetings. Mornings were not her things. I managed to get her up full of coffee, wobbled her down, put her in the chair, the lights came up, Diego's daughter said, "Now, when did you get interested in America? When did you get interested in Mexican art?" And she, with no hesitation, said, "I think probably about 35 years ago," meaning generically from her father, of course. So it's also piece of a poem. It is, if you want to know, and we were talking last night, the whole sort of fallout of this is the culture that Anne grew up in. She wasn't born, of course. This is a show sponsored out of Mexico with DeSias as a big advocate for much of it. Starting at the Met, it traveled under the American Federation of the Arts. Rene Donencourt met his wife Sarah at Marshall Field in Chicago because of this show. It's deeply invested in it. The fun thing is, if you look, it was very famous in crossing all things. Toys, popular arts, Rene's great particular thing was village culture, popular arts, straw. We still have wonderful straw horses and things around the house. But if you look right back, way back, let's see, there it is, way back, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer. You'll see a Henry Clifford painting, so it featured some very great paintings as well as other things. All this moment in the early Depression when all of these things were moving. As we heard yesterday, charmingly, I think, the resistance of some of the more established people at the Met for allowing this hoi polloi sort of into the walls. This is what makes sort of for the founding. One issue for all of that, you might remember, when very early on, one of Rene's closest companions became the Morrows. Mrs. Morrow and Rene did 3 books together, absolutely wonderful thing. They were the great, it's he that sort of worked with Diego to get Cortez's house in Cuernavaca as a site for murals by Diego, et cetera, et cetera. All of this fills, and it's the joy of this, which is I started telling you, this happiness of being a small minority family in there, and the enthusiasms. It must have been loads of fun. And Dr. Attle, from whom we saw a photograph, his name, he was the great volcano lover of all time. Anne's mother always said we had a lot to owe to this very dynamic, extremely outspoken, radical man in all sorts of ways. Because initially the Ministry of Education in Mexico thought they would ask him to do this show circulating in America. He just couldn't get down to it, so they asked Rene Donencourt, and history was made, and the Museum of Modern Art marches on from there. But we got the portrait of Attle and his wonderful love of Attle color, as you all know. Here finally are the murals which we did buy from Via, giving us a nice foundation. Very interestingly, and this is the dynamic of the way that these things were received, when the show, the Diego show, the 1930 Diego show closed, for which these murals which you've just been looking at, for which they were made, the show circulated, but without the murals, they were already too frail to travel. But it came to Philadelphia, but not to the big temple on the hill, to a very WPA, a place on 69th Street, a blue-collar sort of neighborhood. And we're shown there as a sort of sense, an intuitive sense, that popularism, activity from the left, Pacific sort of report, was more open-skinned to this sort of, especially the Diego sort of sentiments, which it was, of course, than it would have been on the big hill, the big house on the hill with the Botticellis. Something very interestingly, and there's my colleague Mark Castro in the audience is working on a show which we'll get to in a moment with other colleagues about this. So just so you think there's any moss on Philadelphia, in anticipation not of the show necessarily, but coordinating with it, was Stokowski lining up with Chavez to do a ballet in Philadelphia called Horsepower, of which here you see some of the things. Wouldn't it be fun when we do our show to reconstruct this ballet, which seems to have been quite a hit, and then tour it around. So there was music, there was art, there was all these things going on in the early 30s, this is, just to cheer you up at the depths of the Depression going through. Very quickly now, we've been involved in lots of projects. We were the passive takers of a wonderful show when the Detroit Museum found the lost drawings. Were not lost, they were just rolled up in a show at a cabinet upstairs from the great Diego cycle that they have in the museum. This is Michael Taylor, now gone to Dartmouth. Hang on to that thought. Dartmouth, leaving Philadelphia. Did in Philadelphia at the same time as Edward's show, a Frida Kahlo show, just to show. And finally, myself, moi-même, but not every moi-même. My great gift as a professional is finding very smart people and sticking right behind them at every step. In this set, you'll see Susan Penn. Sorry, I mumbled. A very ambitious show, one of the most ambitious shows the museum's ever done. But since I was just, as many of you might remember, it is not that far back, was covering the entire sort of colonial things, including Brazil, which is often sort of seen as a separate sort of entity. And one of the great joys of my life, we traveled a lot. It was the first time I got to meet the Hubers because they were already so caught up in that. We'll get back to them in just a minute, but just to remind you, Edward, of course, had already done this major Brazilian show at the Guggenheim. This is from the same church in Olinda as the altarpiece that went straight up through the middle of the Guggenheim, you might recall. It was a hugely ambitious thing. We had it, and it just, I think, in my mind, I'll never look back, and I hope it had some effect, that this was every bit as much fun as doing a Rubens show or a Cezanne show or all those other things we do. Maybe a little more exciting because the material is just so new and the mixing of media is such an easy sort of thing to come off. As I said, I think I met Roberta with Kate, a woman called Katie Luber, who was in Philadelphia at the time. It was actually created a space for the Lamborn collection in a reinstallation in 1994. We went off to see Coco Acala's show called Siglos Doros in Madrid. Remember that? I think it may have been the first time we did a lot of traveling around and became great friends with the Hubers. Learned to enjoy their collection. Here you see it in the house. Here you see it here. It's absolutely a bliss in terms of working with them is such a joy. It is so great to, and this is as long in the making as those of you who were here last night followed. And they're sitting right there. Yes, isn't that nice? Happy pair, smart pair. We've had a wonderful time working with them. I'll just show you. The picture on the left is their lent. They lent very generously to the Tesoro show, so we were sort of all in the same little peapod right from then on. And very nicely it promised a group of very critical things to us, which with Lamborn as our support base for Mexican colonialism, we now have a very strong, as you'll see just by rushing through these wonderful things, a support base for Andean painting as well, with true masterpieces, thanks to the Hubers going through and out. But it's this, we're a big museum, like not so many of them, but things come in. One of the greatest streets, right, Ludington, Santa Barbara, a great collector, a great friend of Picasso, what have you. He gave these to his niece in 1938 as wedding presents. Because you know what, they're chic. Sorry, Lona, they're not only just wonderful Costas paintings, they're chic. We of course, the people who gave them to us knew all about our activity. They saw the show. This is just thanks to another person sitting here in the audience, we did not have a single Venezuelan colonial painting. This is the great master of the 18th century. We now have this sweetly given in honor of Anne. Anne bought this with a friend. Now we're just coming up to speed because today is going to be all about modern activity. Two objects, she and her friend Kippy Stroud Springle bought this picture. The boldest thing, and maybe this, as I said with the Lamborn collection, there are no large pictures. We were able to buy this very large picture, a critical work by Villalpando, a well-documented cycle of Franciscan paintings for Guatemala. Mark Castor was actually doing his dissertation with Gridley, with the wonderful Gridley McKim-Smith. It was wonderful to have that sort of advocacy at Bryn Mawr College, now with Clara Margellini, which is just keeping all of our family stitched together. It's a subject which, interesting enough, never seems to turn up in European iconography. Here you have St. Francis, who famously wouldn't swat a fly. What's he doing? He's dispatching like a toreador. I guess you have to do in the New World was life's getting tougher. I'm making superficial a very sort of complex thing. Purchased by us, the restoration was very wonderfully, it's very nice. The Getty Foundation, the Getty Trust, has been very wonderful about supporting, as you probably know, Latin American things on all sorts of levels, and supported a brilliant young man who became a great friend, coming up for 2 years from Mexico to help us restore this thing. Many of you go to art dealers and things are brought out and put on velvet cushions and they say, you know, mint condition. This picture we know was documented in 3 earthquakes, meaning it did do a little help in that. Or our most recent colonial thing is this wonderful, I think wonderful, then we bought it. So this great king of Puerto Rican painting, Campeche, doing this wonderful, in just wonderful state. But it doesn't stop there. Carlos Basualdo, many of you may know, who is Argentinian and would never identify himself as a Latinist. He's entirely international, but his Latin interest as this took up the whole Arensberg spaces with these, you get a little twitchy in there at certain moments. One of my favorites we bought in collaboration with the Art Institute of Chicago. This, as you know, is probably the most, I shouldn't say because I'm over my head, but an important Peruvian artist. And of course, what's the national image of Peru? Potatoes. What happens when potatoes ferment? They emit, I'm over my head, they emit little gases that can actually, with little tablets stuck in the potato, turn on electric light as if they're the very base under the earth thing is bringing light out of this native sort of industry. It's complicated, it's wonderful. This is why it's fun for me, who are a little slow about contemporary things, working where I work, because one of the keynotes of the Philadelphia Museum, may I say, not even as plugging, but just fact, is that it's a place where very often the present rules the past. It's very nice to see that so many of the activities being driven by what's happening now and seen back and through the collection in all these wonderful ways. Dear, one of the most affecting and thoughtful men, Cuban, of course. Anne Temkin, who was there before, we lost her to the modern, bless her heart, but this, which quickly has become the iconic sort of item of the Mexican modern collection going through. And now I'm here, I'm at the end right now, hurry. Here you're dealing with two generations. Timothy Rubb, our present director, who was director in the 1990s of the 1990s of the museum in Dartmouth, at Dartmouth, and of course loved already and has the biggest sort of Mexican cycle in the United States, and the library by Orozco commissioned a book, an exhibition by these wonderful people here. As you can see up there in the caption. Nicely became great pals with the fellow we commissioned. The show is finally done. And guess what? We now, not that we don't miss Anne, but we have an equally great advocate on staff for all things Latin and all things Mexican. And the very man you saw, Renato, has now joined up with two of our people, both of whom are sitting over there, and we'll introduce you when we get to them, to do a full dress Mexican modernism show closed with Renato being our sort of open door into this happy collaboration, which is also well along. You'll hear more about this. And I'm just going to show you three things just pulled out of our own collection. It will have photographs, it'll have movies perhaps, and certainly paintings, many of which will be from us. And maybe my favorite Latin picture that we have of all time was the Curator. So we've done and have a pretty good history behind us. We have a great foundation. But it's all yet to come. Thank you so much.